democratic reform. I want to pivot to a slightly more optimistic note and ask you, you mentioned earlier Ireland, Belgium as countries where the democratic deliberative systems are working well. So I just want to just pick your brain. How is that working? What's going well there? How has it been implemented?
Yeah, I should stress that there are things that are going well and not well in all of those countries, but there's a particular trend in this idea of a citizens' assembly. And a happier note for conservatives who might be frustrated by what I just said, in British Columbia, Canada, the conservative political party, the BC Liberals, yes, I know they're called Liberals, but that means conservative in British Columbia. It just doesn't translate well across borders. The point is, they actually campaigned on a promise to change the electoral system, but it was a brilliant message. They said, look, we know that you can't trust your elected politicians to change the laws of elections. But we all agree that there's a problem. In particular, the problem there was this situation where a party might have, say, a plurality of the vote, like 43%, but wind up with almost no seats in parliament because of the way the districts are drawn, right? It's not exactly gerrymandering in Canada. It's just the way the math works sometimes creates these totally skewed results. And so they said, all right, but if you elect us, we're going to let a random sample of you decide the new electoral laws, and then we'll put it to a vote. And they won. And the system distorted the vote outcome in exactly the way they had warned, this time in their favor, right? They won almost every seat with a modest plurality. And they followed through on their promise, right? Politicians do that sometimes, right? They created the British Columbia Citizens Assembly, which you're welcome to Google and read about, and they deliberated over several weekends, about 150 people or so, and they came up with a somewhat technical and complicated voting system that's also sort of simple. Think of it as ranked choice voting, but it's actually called single transferable vote, STV. And they had a couple tweaks on it to kind of give rural voters a little different kind of representation, which respected the views of rural British Columbians. And it wound up getting 58% of the vote when it was put to a popular vote. Unfortunately, the threshold was 60% to change the law, so it failed. But it set a powerful precedent. Hey, look, everyday citizens who get to hear from people about a technical issue can actually write a pretty good electoral reform. And this putting it to a vote idea is not a bad one. So fast forward several years, Ireland has a whole bunch of problems it's facing, and they come up with this idea of holding a constitutional convention, and that was followed later by a citizens' assembly. The difference between the two processes is the first one was 2/3 random sample, 1/3 essentially elected legislators. And by the end of that process, the elected legislators said, hey, you know what? This was incredible. Look at all the recommendations we have that came out of this process. They're really smart. Trust me, the legislature, we couldn't have done this for reasons we'd rather not discuss. But let's do it again. But this time you don't need us. You really don't. It's the citizens. It'll have more legitimacy if it's just everyday Irish people. So out of that first convention and then this second assembly came a whole bunch of recommendations. Some weren't acted on, some were implemented directly, and some were put on the ballot. So you've probably, the average listener probably didn't know about all that going on behind the scenes, but they did probably know that Ireland has had some interesting referenda in recent years, such as on abortion, removing blasphemy from the Constitution itself, right? Those all came out of this deliberative process, which you really can trace back to the British Columbia Citizens Assembly. And then Belgium takes it a step farther, because one of the things that makes Oregon special in the Citizens Initiative Review is that it really is written into state law as a recurring process, right? Every 2 years, Oregon has these ballot measures, and every 2 years this is supposed to happen. Well, Belgium says, yeah, no, we're doubling down on all of that. So a German-speaking province, think of it as a sort of analogous to a state here in the United States, decided they're going to set up a permanent, randomly selected body that, rotating membership and so on, that kind of exists in parallel to the previously existing government, and has an advisory role, but a real visibility that gives it probably in the long run some power. And they're not even stopping there. Belgium, other parts of Belgium are talking about doing something similar. There's now a community in England that has set up one of these permanent bodies. And I think you're going to see them popping up all over Western Europe. These randomly selected bodies that are now part of the government and bring the voice of everyday citizens who are not elected, right? So you might worry, oh my gosh, they're not accountable. Well, they're also not under anyone's control, right? They don't have to run for re-election. The party can't discipline them. Special interests don't have a claim on them by virtue of campaign financing or anything like that. So I think we're going to see them offering fresh insight and new perspectives. And the book I wrote last year with Eric Olin Wright, Legislature by Law, talks about this very idea of having an elected body alongside a randomly selected body. Sometimes it's called a sortition body, which is a fancy word for being randomly selected into a public office. So instead of election, it's sortition. But anyway, when those exist in parallel to each other, it'll be really interesting to see what their dynamics are. And from a U.S. perspective, well, we're going to get to watch Belgium, right? We'll get to watch, other countries like that, and maybe it'll come here. We'll see.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine, at least in the United States, doing what Ireland did, where politicians say, you know what, actually, we want less power in this situation.
Well, I'll give you two scenarios in which it's quite likely. One, remember, the Irish politicians couldn't touch abortion. I mean, this is a Catholic country. At the same time, they knew that the status quo was problematic for all sorts of reasons. And so there are some issues that they would just as soon push off of their agenda. They're just getting torn to tatters over this issue, and they'd really rather say, okay, public, you feel strongly about this, sort it out, vote it out, and we'll be done with it, right? And then there's a second kind of issue that they maybe don't really care one way or the other, whether it's solution A or solution B, they're fine, right? There may be some broad parameters within which, they can live with it. And let's just hand that over to the public, right? Because we might get some legitimacy. We don't care about the policy outcome. It's not like we're getting in trouble on this issue, but we're going to get some legitimacy by virtue of giving you some power. There's a process called the deliberative poll, initiated by Jim Fishkin back at the University of Texas. Now he's at Stanford. And the deliberative poll is pretty straightforward. You get a really high quality, large random sample, and you survey them as individuals beforehand. Then they get a chance to deliberate, typically face-to-face, but now sometimes online. And then afterwards, as individuals, they are surveyed again, and you look for the change, right? Was there a shift in public opinion? Well, in a few places, that process has become powerful. In Mongolia, the deliberative poll is now potentially a piece of the constitutional amendment process. So if you want to change the Constitution, it may have to go through this body before you can finally vote on it, depending on a few sort of circumstances. And in China, of all places, the deliberative poll has become a somewhat popular tool for what we might call sort of county or regional decision making. So I know it's an authoritarian country, right? Why would they mess around with democracy? Well, think about it. The central party wants to maintain control, but it also needs to maintain legitimacy. This is the problem with autocrats, right? You have to maintain legitimacy, or ultimately you fall. Well, there's a lot of things the central party does not care about one way or the other, but they want that legitimacy. So what they say to the county official is, look, you need to come up with a coherent economic development plan. There's a whole range of things that we can live with. Why don't you put all of those on the agenda, get yourself a random sample, let them deliberate, and just let them decide, and then just implement it. And so in China, that's what happens sometimes is, the very high response rates, right? When the government says, we'd like you. Yeah, okay, sure, I'm here. But it doesn't take people very long to kind of get into the spirit of it. They realize, hey, all of these options really are safe, right? The government isn't going to get pissed off if we like option D, or they wouldn't have put it there, right? Option K maybe isn't on the agenda because we're not allowed to choose it. But all right, here we go. A through E, let's debate it. All right, we want D. And the government says, hey, good, you want option D. All right, now I'm going to do it and shut up and go home. Well, that's, kind of crazy. But again, I go to an authoritarian country to emphasize the point that actually sometimes elected officials do want to give you power, maybe within limits, right? But they want you to exercise some degree of power because it will reflect well on them.
Extremely fascinating. I'm going to take what little time we have left. I'm going to turn our wheels real sharp. And I swear I'll tie this back into like general democratic systems eventually. But right off the bat, I want to ask about your question about your book, Dungeon Party. And could you describe what the general outline of what Dungeon Party is?
Sure. So I've written a lot of nonfiction books going back to, back in the early 90s. I've always been interested in fiction, and in the last 10 years, I really became convinced that a neat way to kind of reach a whole new readership is to talk about some of the ideas that have been percolating in my academic career through fiction. And Dungeon Party is half of my scholarship is really on group behavior, how small groups behave and how they influence us and shape us, not only in political contexts, but other ones as well. And Dungeon Party is really a celebration of gaming culture. It's having a moment right now, even before the pandemic. If you didn't know it, Dungeons and Dragons has the largest player base it ever had. I kind of thought it was a thing from my childhood, right, in the 70s and 80s, and it was, but it's having a huge comeback, probably because people who played it a long time ago are now raising their kids on it, but it's more than that. And there's so many different role-playing games out there. But what people who don't play these games know is that they can be incredibly powerful kind of emotional and social experiences for the players who are really committing huge chunks of their lives to sitting down with the same group of people and imagining these worlds and scenarios. So Dungeon Party is a funny crossover between a literary novel about gaming culture in San Diego, California, and then a little bit of a fantasy novel about the characters in the fantasy world, in the mythos. And it's about the ties between the real world players who play this game and have all sorts of conflicts and problems and triumphs, and the players they're playing and what those players are experiencing. And it really does affect you to have your players have certain experiences. Sometimes you try things out, you try out new identities, try out new social tactics and so on, and they can wind up reflecting back on you, usually in really positive ways, but not always.
So the way I want to tie that in is game theory is a way in political systems, political science, for both to model decision making and predicting behavior. And I want to know your thoughts on role-playing games as essentially deliberative games and how that could tie into a new way to think about this political theory.
Right. So let's actually put next to each other two whole bodies of work in academia. One, you're right, is game theory, and the one that people are most familiar with is the prisoner's dilemma. The game of chicken is also sometimes used. For instance, that's where two cars are driving at each other at full speed. Who's going to blink first, right? Who's going to turn out of the way and avoid the collision? That's actually used commonly to talk about foreign policy and being on the brink of war. So these games that are simple mathematical abstractions of complex social relationships have been useful to think about strategy and tactics. There's a whole nother literature on games, game design, and sometimes the word gamification is used, where the principles of game design are actually built into processes. So think, for instance, of how games sometimes motivate you. If you play mobile games on your phone, there's incentives to keep checking in, right? Oh, there's energy now I have to use for my new characters, or oh, there's a new offer, right? Maybe you're buying something, but maybe they're just getting your attention, right? Well, the game is compelling enough that it keeps drawing you in. Now imagine if that same design principle was applied to an app that had a more pro-social benefit, but something about it was compelling, like a game, and you were kind of playing this game. Well, that can be very powerful at motivating people, and that's actually where the next 10 years of my research are already headed, is into this idea that democracy needs to get smarter online. We need to have ways of engaging with people and issues that are super captivating and engrossing and enlightening, really, that make us smarter, better, happier, more engaged. And Facebook ain't it. So I've jokingly created this term, the democracy machine, to imagine a whole network of online processes, from social media to prediction markets and so on, that could potentially be woven together and woven in with governments in ways that give citizens a voice, an ongoing voice that influences government. And again, for some of the reasons we've talked about already, and others we haven't, there are all kinds of reasons the government might actually want to have a more engaged public, to get that legitimacy and get that timely input on all kinds of issues. But I think in small ways, we could start moving there. And a colleague, Todd Davies at Stanford University, again, there it is again, he and I have been writing a little bit together on the concept of a corporation for public software, where there would be a federally funded body that would be creating non